What's up, Bible Boot Camp? This is your Revelation review for part 1 of chapter 2, the letter to the church in Ephesus. In chapter 1, we saw John imprisoned on the island of Patmos. It had been 63 years since the resurrection of Jesus and the day of Pentecost. The era of the apostles have come and gone, churches have been established, and now the next generation has taken up the mantle to lead the way. One last remaining disciple, John, nearing the end of his life, receives a vision, and it's a vision of Jesus from heaven with a message. Jesus has chosen 7 of the over 100 churches in existence to deliver a personal letter to, a letter from him. And John is to write down these very specific 7 letters for the 7 churches, the first one being the church in Ephesus. Now, Ephesus had been a city established more than 1,000 years back upon the worship of the goddess Diana. Its entire city life centered around her. They worshiped her much like we worship Jesus. In the same way you 100% believe Jesus is real, they believed she was real, and they were fiercely devoted to her. This was the setting that we find Paul in the book of Acts entering into to start a church. It would be this very church that decades later, Jesus would write this letter to. When Paul first comes to the city, the year was 52 AD. It had been about 20 years since the time of Jesus, and Paul first goes there to preach in the synagogues of Ephesus to the Jews, telling them of the way, as it was called, referring to Jesus being the way, the truth, and the life. But when the Jews in Ephesus rejected the message, he would turn his attention to the Gentiles in the city. Each day he would work until early afternoon and then spend his time in the lecture hall of Tyrannus preaching about Christ. Now, this was highly controversial to the Ephesians because he was contradicting their beloved Diana worship, and riots broke out. Paul and the believers would persist, though, and the church would grow. Paul's big admonition to them that you can read about in Acts 18 through 20 and in his letter to them in the book of Ephesians was to stay strong in their doctrine and not give in to the pagan worship and false teachers that would overrun the city. 35 years later, it's interesting that Jesus would write this letter to them bragging on their good deeds, and this was one of it. Staying strong to good doctrine was their strong point, and he commended them for that. However, although they were really good at pointing out false teaching, they failed at one thing. They had forgotten their first love. In other words, they spent so much time on doing the business of the king that they didn't have time for the king. This was the downfall. They had done good works, but had chosen doctrine over devotion. But Jesus was writing this letter as an encouragement for them to get back on track. But it came with a warning. Return to him, or he would remove their lampstand from the church. In the end, this is exactly what would happen. The church of Ephesus failed and was figuratively and literally wiped away, and neither the church or the city survived. It was a lesson for Ephesus to learn. But Jesus' letter is so much more than that. From heaven and having eternity in mind, this was a letter written literally outside of time and space and intended for all of history to learn from. You see, it was specific to the church of Ephesus then in 95 AD, but it was intended for all churches then and now to learn from, as he writes, to all the churches. But this was also intended for you and I to learn from personally when it comes to our works and our devotion. This closing statement starts off, anyone with ears to hear must listen. But there may be more to Jesus' letter here than meets the eye. These 7 letters from Jesus might also lay out the entire panorama of church history. You see, the book of Acts covers about 30 years of church history. But as we study these 7 letters from Jesus, we're going to discover that they cover the next 2,000. And we'll learn about that interesting topic next time on Revelation Review.